The dust settled on everything in Millbrook County like a curse that wouldn't lift. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell pressed her palm against the ache in her lower back, feeling the weight of the child she carried pull at her spine with each labored step. Her worn leather boots, once polished and proper for Sunday service, now bore the scars of 3 weeks walking back roads and forgotten highways. The soles had separated from the uppers near her left big toe, letting in stones and regret in equal measure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung merciless overhead, a white-hot coin in a sky the color of old pewter. September in Texas meant heat that wrapped around you like wet wool, and Sarah's maternity dress, the only one she owned, clung to her swollen frame with desperate persistence. The fabric had once been cheerful yellow, dotted with tiny blue flowers that reminded her of spring mornings when hope still lived in her chest. Now it was the color of mustard left too long in the sun, stained with sweat and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones. Her stomach cramped with hunger, the baby inside her shifting restlessly as if it too understood their predicament. She'd eaten nothing since yesterday's stale biscuit, shared with a stray dog outside the Texaco station in Brownfield. The dog was grateful. The attendant had been less so, watching her through the grimy window with the kind of suspicion reserved for drifters and dreamers who'd run out of both luck and options. 3 weeks ago, Sarah had owned a house. Small, yes, with a leaky roof and windows that wouldn't open properly, but it had been hers. The deed bore her late husband's name, Thomas James Hartwell, and for 6 months after his funeral, she'd managed to scrape together the mortgage payments through a combination of pride and stubbornness. She'd taken in sewing, mended clothes for neighbors who paid her in quarters and canned goods, stretched every dollar until it screamed. But pride doesn't pay property taxes, and stubbornness can't stop a bank from foreclosure proceedings. When the men in suits came with their clipboards and legal papers, they'd been polite enough, professional. They'd given her 48 hours to gather what she could carry and vacate the premises. She'd spent those hours staring at walls she'd painted herself, at the kitchen table where she and Thomas had shared their first meal as newlyweds, at the bedroom where she discovered she was carrying his child, just 2 weeks before the accident that took him away. The accident. Even now, walking this endless ribbon of asphalt toward nowhere in particular, she couldn't bring herself to examine the details too closely. Thomas had been a good man, a careful man, the kind who checked his mirrors twice and always used his turn signal. But good men die too, sometimes by their own hand when the weight of failure becomes too much to bear. The insurance investigator had been thorough, kind even, when he'd explained that policies don't pay out for intentional acts, especially when the insured had been drinking. Sarah had protested, of course. Thomas barely touched alcohol, maybe a beer on Sundays while watching football, maybe a glass of wine on their anniversary. But the blood test results were unmistakable, and the empty bottle of bourbon they'd found in his truck told a story she'd never heard him speak aloud. The investigator had shown her the note, just 4 words in Thomas's careful handwriting. She deserves better alone. She'd burned the note the same night, watching the paper curl and blacken in the kitchen sink while tears fell onto the ashes. Some truths were too heavy for anyone else to carry, even if keeping them meant carrying them yourself until they crushed you. The baby kicked now, a sharp jab against her ribs that made her gasp and stumble. She pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the solid reality of life growing inside her. 7 months along, according to Dr. Martinez back in Brownfield, though she hadn't been back to see him since the insurance lapsed. The baby was healthy, active, apparently unaware that its mother had become a ghost haunting the highways of West Texas with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and $17 in crumpled bills. The road stretched ahead like a punishment. Heat waves rising from the asphalt and shimmering curtains that made the horizon dance. To her left, Mesquite trees twisted up from the hard-pan soil like arthritic fingers, their thorns catching the light. To her right, an endless expanse of brown grass and cattle fence, wires strung between posts that leaned at weary angles. This was a country that broke people, that took their dreams and ground them into dust fine enough to blow away on the next wind. She'd been walking since dawn, leaving the truck stop outside La Mesa, where she'd spent the night curled in a bathroom stall, her cardboard suitcase as a pillow and her jacket as a blanket. The attendant had found her there around 5 in the morning, a kid maybe 19 with acne scars and kind eyes who'd given her a cup of coffee and pointed her toward the highway. "Ranch country out that way," he'd said, nodding west. "Folks out there sometimes need help with cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing, especially during branding season." She'd thanked him and started walking, though she knew nothing about ranches or branding or the kind of work that might be available to a pregnant woman with soft hands and a college education in art history. Her mother had always said she was too delicate for real work, too refined for anything that might soil her manicured nails or strain her smooth complexion. "Ladies don't labor," she'd said, sitting in the parlor of their house in Dallas, surrounded by doilies and crystal figurines that serve no purpose except to prove their refinement. Sarah's nails were broken now, dirt caked beneath what remained of them. Her complexion bore the marks of sun and wind and the kind of exhaustion that showed in the shadows under your eyes. If her mother could see her now trudging along a country road like a common vagrant, carrying a dead man's child with nowhere to go and no prospects except the charity of strangers, she'd probably faint dead away onto her imported Persian rug. The thought should have brought shame, but Sarah found herself too tired for shame. Too tired for anything except the mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other, following the yellow line down the center of the road like it might lead somewhere that mattered. The cramping in her stomach grew stronger, and she paused beside a culvert where a trickle of brown water moved sluggishly through the concrete tube. She lowered herself carefully onto the guardrail, feeling the metal warm through her dress, and reached into her suitcase for the water bottle she'd filled at the truck stop. Half empty already, and the next town was still hours away according to the last road sign she'd passed Dot as she drank. She let her mind wander to the baby, to the person growing inside her who would soon need more than she could provide. She'd felt the first kicks back in June, gentle flutters that had made her laugh out loud in the grocery store. Now the movements were stronger, more insistent, as if the baby was trying to remind her that it existed, that it mattered, that it deserved better than a mother who'd lost everything except the capacity to keep walking. She'd tried to imagine what Thomas would have said about their situation. He'd been a practical man, an accountant who believed in spreadsheets and 5-year plans and the kind of careful financial management that should have prevented exactly this sort of catastrophe. But he'd also been tender, the kind of man who left her notes in her lunch bag and brought her wildflowers he'd picked beside the road. He would have found a solution. She was certain. He would have made it work somehow. But Thomas was gone, and his final solution had left her here beside a country road with nowhere to go and no one to call. Her parents had made their feelings clear when she'd married him. An accountant from a working-class family wasn't good enough for their daughter, they'd said. They'd softened somewhat when grandchildren seemed possible, but the softness had hardened again when those grandchildren failed to materialize year after year. They'd sent flowers to Thomas's funeral and a brief note expressing their condolences. But the underlying message had been clear. She'd made her bed when she'd chosen him over their wishes. Her sister Monica lived in California now, married to a surgeon and busy with charity luncheons and tennis lessons. They exchanged Christmas cards and birthday calls, but the distance between them had grown beyond mere geography. Monica's life was champagne and symphony galas. Sarah's had become food stamps and second-hand clothes. The gulf was too wide to bridge with a phone call asking for help. The sun climbed higher, and Sarah forced herself to stand again. The baby shifted as she rose, settling into a new position that sent shooting pains down her left leg. She'd read about this in the pregnancy books she borrowed from the library. Sciatica, common in the third trimester when the baby's weight pressed against certain nerves. The books had recommended gentle exercise, warm baths, and plenty of rest. They hadn't mentioned what to do when you were living in your car until the car got repossessed, or when rest was a luxury you couldn't afford because you needed to keep moving to stay ahead of the despair that followed you like a hungry dog. She resumed walking, focusing on the rhythm of her steps and the sound of her breathing. The road curved ahead, disappearing behind a low hill crowned with live oak trees. Beyond that, more road, more heat, more of the endless Texas landscape that seemed designed to remind you how small and insignificant you were in the grand scheme of things. But as she crested the hill, something changed. The road straightened out again, running toward a cluster of buildings in the distance that looked more substantial than the scattered farmhouses she'd passed all morning. A water tower rose above the structures, and she could make out what might be a main street lined with trees. Not a city exactly, but a real town with real people, who might have real work for someone desperate enough to take it. The sight should have lifted her spirits, but instead, it filled her with a familiar dread. She'd been through this before arriving at a new place with hope in her heart and desperation in her eyes, only to discover that small towns were suspicious of strangers, especially pregnant strangers with no visible means of support. The questions would start immediately. Where was her husband? Where was her family? How had she ended up here, alone and obviously in need? She'd learned to have answers ready, a story that was close enough to the truth to be believable, but sanitized enough to avoid pity. She was traveling to meet her sister in California. Her husband had died in an accident, and she was starting over. She had money coming, a settlement from the insurance company. She just needed a little help to tide her over until it arrived. The lies came easier now, polished smooth by repetition. But they still left a bitter taste in her mouth, still. Made her feel like she was betraying Thomas's memory by hiding the truth of what he'd done. He'd been a good man who'd made a terrible choice, and she'd been the one left to live with the consequences. The town grew larger as she approached, resolving into individual buildings and streets. She could see a gas station, a diner, what looked like a general store. Normal, everyday places where normal people lived normal lives, unaware that a desperate woman with a cardboard suitcase was walking toward them like a storm. They couldn't see coming. Sarah adjusted her grip on the suitcase handle and kept walking. The baby was quiet now, perhaps lulled by the steady rhythm of her steps, or perhaps conserving energy for whatever came next. She envied the baby its ignorance, its complete dependence on her to navigate the complexities of the world beyond the womb. For now, at least, it was safe, warm, fed by her body, even when her body had nothing left to give. But that wouldn't last much longer. Soon the baby would be born, would need milk and diapers and a safe place to sleep. It would need a mother who could provide more than just love and determination. It would need a mother who had answers, who had a plan, who had something more than $17 in a broken suitcase full of memories. The town was closer now, close enough to see the paint peeling from the water tower, close enough to read the sign that said, "Welcome to Cedar Creek, population 847. Small then, but not tiny. Big enough to have businesses that might need help. Small enough that a pregnant stranger wouldn't disappear entirely into the crowd." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She would find work here, she decided. Whatever it took, whatever she had to do, she would find a way to make it work until the baby came. After that, she'd figure out the next step, then the step after that, building a life one day at a time. The way Thomas had taught her to balance a checkbook carefully, methodically. Never looking too far ahead, because that way lay madness. The road began to slope downward now, carrying her towards Cedar Creek and whatever waited for her there. She could see people moving between the buildings, could hear the distant sound of traffic and voices and the everyday business of a functioning community. It looked like a place where people knew their neighbors, where children played in front yards and families gathered for Sunday dinner. It looked like the kind of place where a pregnant woman walking alone down the highway might be noticed, might be helped, might be given a chance to prove she was worth the risk. Or it might be the kind of place where strangers were viewed with suspicion, where a woman without a wedding ring and a believable story would be politely but firmly encouraged to move along to the next town, the next county, the next state if necessary. Sarah would find out soon enough. The baby kicked again, and she pressed her hand to the spot, feeling the small foot or elbow pushing against her palm. "Almost there," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the baby or herself. "Just a little bit further." The sun was directly overhead now, beating down with the full force of a Texas summer that refused to acknowledge the calendar's insistence that autumn was coming. Her shadow had shrunk to a small dark pool at her feet, offering no relief from the heat that seemed to rise from the pavement in visible waves. But she kept walking, because walking was all she had left. Walking in the hope that somewhere ahead, in the town of Cedar Creek, or the next town beyond it, someone would look at her with kindness instead of judgment, would see a woman in need instead of a problem to be solved or avoided. She kept walking, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant failing the child who depended on her for everything. She might not have money or prospects or a plan that extended beyond the next meal, but she had stubborn determination bred in her bones and love for her unborn child that burned brighter than the Texas sun. It would have to be enough, because it was all she had. Cedar Creek proved to be less welcoming than Sarah had hoped. The diner refused her request to work for a meal. The general store clerk watched her with narrowed eyes as she counted out coins for a sleeve of crackers, and the gas station attendant had been blunt in his assessment. "Ma'am, you look like you need a hospital more than a job." By late afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting on a bench outside the post office, her cardboard suitcase at her feet and her hope dwindling with the daylight. The crackers sat heavy in her stomach, and the baby had grown increasingly restless, pressing against her bladder with uncomfortable persistence. She needed a bathroom, a place to rest, and most urgently, she needed someone to look at her with something other than pity or suspicion. An elderly woman emerged from the post office, her gray hair pinned in a neat bun and her floral dress pressed with military precision. She paused when she saw Sarah, her blue eyes taking in the worn suitcase, the tired posture, the obvious pregnancy that strained against the faded yellow dress. "You waiting for someone, dear?" The woman's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize trouble when she saw it. "No, ma'am." Sarah straightened, mustering what dignity she had left. "Just resting a moment before I move on." The woman studied her for a long moment, then sat down on the opposite end of the bench. "I'm Martha Pemberton. Been living in Cedar Creek since Roosevelt was president." "The first Roosevelt." She folded her hands in her lap. "You look like you've been traveling a while." "Yes, ma'am. I'm Sarah Hartwell. I'm between situations at the moment." Martha's eyes flicked to Sarah's left hand, noting the pale band of skin where a wedding ring had recently resided. "Sometimes life takes us places we never expected to go. Question is, where are you headed from here?" "West," Sarah said, because it was easier than admitting she had no destination in mind. "California. Eventually. California's a long way from here, especially for someone in your condition." Martha's voice held no judgment, just observation. "When's that baby due?" "October." The words slipped out before Sarah could consider whether sharing such personal information was wise. "October," Martha repeated the word thoughtfully. "That's soon. You got people waiting for you in California? Sarah hesitated. The lie about her sister had served her well in other towns, but something in Martha's steady gaze made deception feel heavier than usual. I'm hoping to find work. Start fresh. Martha stood slowly, her knees creaking in protest. Well, Sarah Hartwell, I don't know what brought you to Cedar Creek, but I do know you can't hitchhike to California in your condition. Dangerous for you and that baby. I've been managing fine so far. Have you now? Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. When's the last time you had a proper meal, a real bed? A doctor to check on that child you're carrying? The questions hit like physical blows, each one highlighting another failure in Sarah's careful facade of competence. She pressed her lips together, unwilling to voice the answers that would only confirm what Martha clearly already suspected. There's a ranch about 8 miles north of town, Martha continued, as if Sarah had responded. Man named Jake Reeves. Owns it. Lost his wife a few years back, been struggling to keep up with everything on his own. He's too proud to admit he needs help and too stubborn to hire it, but that place is falling apart around his ears. Sarah looked up sharply. You suggesting I just show up at some stranger's ranch and ask for work? I'm suggesting you consider it. Jake's a good man, decent man. Got a big heart even if he tries to hide it behind all that cowboy stoicism. If you're truly looking for honest work and a fresh start, you could do worse than the Reeves Ranch. I don't know anything about ranch work. Neither did his wife when she married him. Mary was a city girl from Houston, came out here with nothing but determination and learned as she went. Jake taught her everything she needed to know. Martha's expression softened. Course, that was different circumstances entirely. But the point stands, willingness to learn counts for more than experience sometimes. Sarah felt the baby shift, a rolling movement that made her breath catch. She needed to find somewhere safe before labor began, somewhere she could give birth without ending up in a charity ward with social workers asking questions she couldn't answer. How would I even get there? 8 miles is a long walk in my condition. Charlie Morrison runs deliveries out that way twice a week. His truck's not fancy, but it beats walking. He'll be heading out tomorrow morning. Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. This should cover your fare, with enough left over for a decent breakfast at Mel's Cafe. Sarah stared at the money, her throat tightening. I can't take this. You don't even know me, don't I? Martha's smile was gentle but knowing. I know you're scared. I know you're alone. I know you're carrying a child that deserves better than whatever circumstances brought you here. Sometimes knowing that much is enough. What if Jake Reeves doesn't? Want help? What if he takes one look at me and sends me away? Then you'll be no worse off than you are right now, except you'll know you tried. Martha stood again, brushing invisible lint from her dress. But Jake's not the type to turn away someone genuinely in need, especially not a pregnant woman. Sarah accepted the money with trembling fingers, the bills feeling both substantial and insufficient in her palm. How can I repay you? By taking care of yourself and that baby. By giving Jake Reeves a chance to be the man I know he is. And maybe, if things work out, by staying long enough to put some life back into that ranch. Martha gathered her purse. Charlie's truck will be at the general store at 7 sharp. Don't be late. He's got a schedule to keep. As Martha walked away, her sensible shoes clicking against the sidewalk, Sarah remained on the bench, staring at the $5 bill. The gesture was small but monumental, a reminder that kindness still existed in a world that had seemed determined to prove otherwise. That evening, Sarah used part of Martha's gift to rent a room at Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house, a narrow space with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the alley behind the hardware store. The mattress sagged in the middle and the wallpaper was peeling near the ceiling, but it was clean and private and blessedly cool after the heat of the day. She spent the night alternating between excitement and terror. imagining the ranch that might become her salvation or her next disappointment. Jake Reeves remained a mystery. Martha's description painted him as decent but grieving, proud but struggling. Would he see her as help or as a burden? Would he understand her desperation or judge her for it? The baby was active throughout the night, turning and stretching as if it too sensed the approaching change. Sarah found herself talking to it in whispers, explaining their situation and promising that somehow, some way she would find them a safe place to land. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Sarah washed with cold water from the pitcher, combed her hair as neatly as possible, and put on her cleanest dress, a navy blue cotton that had belonged to Thomas's mother. It was too big in the shoulders and too tight across her expanding middle, but it was respectable and modest, the kind of thing a ranch owner might approve of. Charlie Morrison's truck was already idling outside the general store when she arrived, its engine coughing like an old man with too many years of cigarettes behind him. Charlie himself was weathered and grizzled, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen everything twice. "You the gal Martha told me about?" He looked her up and down, taking in her condition with the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who'd delivered pregnant women to their destinations before. "Heading out to the Reeves place?" "Yes, sir. If the offer still stands." "Stands as much as this old truck does. Climb in, but mind the door handle. It's got a trick to it." The truck's interior smelled of motor oil, coffee, and decades of Texas dust. Sarah settled herself as comfortably as possible on the cracked VINYL seat, her suitcase balanced on her lap. Charlie ground the gears and pulled away from the curb with a lurch that made her grab the door handle for support. "Jake know you're coming?" Charlie asked as they cleared the town limits and began the journey north. "No, sir. Martha suggested I might find work there, but she didn't say anything about advance notice." Charlie chuckled, a rough sound that might have been approval. "That's Martha for you. She's got a way of arranging people's lives whether they ask for it or not. Usually works out for the best, though. She's got good instincts about folks." The landscape outside the windows shifted from the packed earth and scattered buildings of Cedar Creek to rolling pastureland dotted with cattle and mesquite trees. Barbed wire fences stretched toward the horizon, marking property lines and territorial boundaries with mathematical precision. This was working land, Sarah realized, not the decorative ranches of wealthy city folks who wanted to play cowboy. "On weekends, what's Mr. Reeves like?" she asked as they bounced over a cattle guard, the metal bars clanging beneath the truck's tires. "Jake's good people. Keeps to himself mostly, ever since Mary passed. That woman was the light of his life. And when cancer took her..." Charlie shook his head. "Man's been going through the motions ever since. Ranch is suffering for it, though he'd deny it if you asked him. How long ago did she die?" 3 years this past spring. Jake was devoted to her, absolutely devoted. They tried for years to have children, never could make it happen. Mary used to say the ranch was their baby, the way they poured everything into it. Charlie downshifted as they approached a steep hill. After she died, Jake just shut down. Does the bare minimum to keep the cattle fed and the bills paid, but the heart's gone out of him. Sarah felt a familiar pang of recognition. She understood the weight of loss, the way grief could hollow you out until you were just going through the motions of living. Perhaps that shared experience might help her connect with Jake Reeves, might make him more sympathetic to her own desperate circumstances. How big is the ranch? 5,000 acres, give or take. Good grazing land, reliable water sources, solid infrastructure when it's properly maintained. Jake's daddy built it up from nothing, and Jake was doing right by it until Mary got sick. Now. Charlie gestured vaguely at the landscape. "Well, you'll see for yourself soon enough." They crested the hill, and the Reeves Ranch spread out below them like a picture from a Western movie. The main house sat in a grove of live oaks, A two-story structure with a wraparound porch and windows that reflected the morning sun like watchful eyes. Outbuildings scattered around it, barns, corrals, storage sheds, and worker quarters that spoke of more prosperous times. But even from a distance, Sarah could see the signs of neglect Charlie had mentioned. Paint peeled from the barn siding. Fence posts leaned at precarious angles, and weeds had overtaken what might once have been flower gardens. It was still beautiful, still impressive in scope and potential, but it wore its abandonment like a mourning shroud. "There's the main gate," Charlie said, pointing to an elaborate wrought iron entrance flanked by stone pillars. The metalwork was intricate, spelling out Reeves Ranch in elegant script, but rust had begun to claim the letters, and one of the gates hung slightly askew as they approached. Sarah's nerves began to flutter like trapped birds in her chest. This was her moment of truth, her chance to convince a grieving widower that a pregnant stranger could somehow help restore what he'd lost. The odds seemed impossibly long, but desperation had a way of making impossible things seem merely difficult. Charlie pulled up to the gate and honked his horn twice. After a moment, a figure emerged from the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor. Even at a distance, Sarah could see the weariness in his posture, the way he carried himself like someone bearing an invisible weight. Jake Reeves approached the truck with measured steps, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each stride. He wore faded jeans, a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a battered cowboy hat that had seen better decades. His face was tanned and angular, marked by lines that spoke of both weather and worry. "Charlie," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting over wind and cattle. "Wasn't expecting any deliveries today." "Got a passenger for you, Jake. Lady here's looking for work." Charlie nodded toward Sarah, who suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable under Jake's scrutiny. Jake's dark eyes found hers through the truck's windshield, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. She saw surprise there, then confusion, then something that might have been recognition, not of her specifically, but of the desperation she carried like a visible burden. He walked around to her side of the truck, and Charlie rolled down her window. Up close, Jake was younger than she'd expected, probably no more than 35, but his eyes held the kind of old grief that aged a person from the inside out. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Charlie says you're looking for work." Sarah's mouth went dry. This was the moment when her carefully rehearsed explanations would either open a door or close it forever. She looked into Jake Reeves' weathered face, saw the wariness there, and made a decision that surprised even herself. She told him the truth. "My name is Sarah Hartwell. My husband died 4 months ago, and I lost our house to foreclosure. I'm 7 months pregnant with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I don't know anything about ranch work, but I'm willing to learn. I can cook, clean, keep books if you need it. I just ... Her voice broke slightly. "I just need a chance to prove I'm worth taking a risk on." Jake stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the polite refusal, the gentle suggestion that she try somewhere else, anywhere else. Instead, Jake opened the truck door and offered her his hand. "Well then," he said quietly, "I reckon we'd better get you inside before you have that baby right here in Charlie's truck." Jake's hand was calloused and warm, steadying Sarah as she climbed down from Charlie's truck with careful movements. The guilt's baby seemed to settle as her feet touched solid ground, as if it too recognized that something significant had shifted in their circumstances. Charlie handed down her cardboard suitcase with a knowing nod. "Take care of yourself, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "Jake, here's one of the good ones." He caught Jake's eye. "You need anything delivered from town, you let me know." As the truck disappeared back down the dusty road, Sarah found herself alone with Jake Reeves in the shadow of the wrought iron gate. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with unspoken questions and careful assessments. A red-winged blackbird called from somewhere in the mesquite trees, its cry sharp against the afternoon air. "House is." "This way," Jake said finally, shouldering her suitcase despite her protests. "You'll want to get out of this heat." The main house loomed larger as they approached, its white clapboard siding streaked with dirt and its green shutters faded to the color of sage. The wrap-around porch sagged slightly on the east side, and several of the spindles in the railing had snapped, leaving jagged wooden teeth. But the bones of the structure were solid, built by hands that understood how to make things last. Jake climbed the porch steps with practiced ease, avoiding the third board which had rotted through near the edge. Sarah followed more cautiously, one hand on the railing and the other pressed to her lower back where the ache had become a constant companion. "Front door sticks," Jake explained, shouldering it open with the familiarity of a long habit. "Been meaning to playing it down, but ... He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. The interior of the house struck Sarah immediately with its contradictions. The furniture was quality, solid oak pieces that spoke of money and taste, but dust covered every surface like a fine gray. Snow. Dishes sat unwashed in the kitchen sink, and newspapers were stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, some dating back months. It was the home of a man who had stopped caring about details, who performed only the most essential tasks required for survival. "There's a bedroom upstairs that might suit you," Jake said, setting her suitcase down in the front hallway. "Used to be. Well, it's got good light and its own washstand." Sarah could hear the careful edit in his words, the way he'd stopped himself from explaining whose room it had been. Mary's room perhaps, or the room they'd prepared for children who never came. She nodded without pressing for details. "I don't expect charity, Mr. Reeves. I meant what I said about working for my keep. Jake," he corrected. "And we'll figure out the work arrangements. First thing is getting you settled and making sure you and that baby are healthy." He gestured toward the kitchen. "There's not much in the way of fresh food, but I can make some eggs if you're hungry." The offer of food made Sarah's stomach clench with desperate gratitude, but she forced herself to maintain some dignity. "I'd appreciate that. And perhaps you could tell me what needs doing around here. I noticed the garden could use attention." Jake's expression darkened slightly. "Garden's been neglected. Haven't had much use for flowers lately." "Not flowers," Sarah said quickly. "Vegetables, herbs, practical plants that could help feed us both and maybe provide some income if there's surplus to sell in town." Something shifted in Jake's face. Surprise, perhaps even a glimmer of interest. "You know about vegetable gardening?" "Some. My grandmother had a large garden when I was growing up. I spent summers helping her preserve tomatoes and beans, learning which plants grew well together." Sarah touched her belly gently. "A pregnant woman needs proper nutrition, and vegetables are cheaper than meat." Jake studied her for a moment, and Sarah sensed she'd passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. "Kitchen's through here. We can talk about the garden while I cook." The kitchen was spacious but showed the same signs of neglect as the rest of the house. A large farmhouse sink sat beneath a window that overlooked what had once been a flower garden, now overrun with Johnson grass and volunteer sunflowers. Cast iron pans hung from hooks above a substantial gas stove, and mason jars lined open shelves, some empty, others containing mysterious contents that might once have been preserves. Jake moved through the space with efficiency, cracking eggs into a blue ceramic bowl and lighting the stove with a wooden match. "Mary canned everything that grew on this place," he said without looking up. "Peaches, green beans, tomato sauce, pickled cucumbers. Root cellar still full of jars from the last year she ... He stopped, his jaw tightening. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. The words came out flat, final, closing off further discussion. Sarah watched him cook, noting the practiced way he handled the pan, the careful attention he paid to the heat. These were skills learned through necessity rather than passion, she realized. He was a man who had taught himself to survive in the kitchen after losing the person who had made it a place of nourishment and warmth. "The eggs are ready," he said, sliding them onto a chipped plate and setting it before her at the kitchen table. The surface was scarred from years of use, marked with knife cuts and water rings that spoke of family meals and daily life. Sarah ate slowly, making each bite last. The eggs were perfectly cooked, fluffy and seasoned with just enough salt. When had she last tasted food prepared with such simple competence? At the truck stops and diners of her recent journey, everything had been either overcooked or underseasoned. Fuel rather than nourishment. "There's bread in the pantry if you want some," Jake offered, but Sarah shook her head. "This is perfect. Thank you." As she ate, Jake leaned against the counter and studied her with the same careful assessment he might give a horse he was considering purchasing. "Not unkind, but thorough, practical. You said your husband died 4 months ago. Mind me asking, how?" Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She'd prepared for this question, but the gentle way Jake asked it caught her off guard. "Car accident," she said, which was true as far as it went. He was driving home from work one evening." Jake nodded, accepting the abbreviated version without pushing for details. "Insurance give you any trouble?" "Some." Another truth that concealed more than it revealed. There were complications, always are. Jake poured himself a cup of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting on the stove since morning. "You got family anywhere? People who might come looking for you?" The question carried an undertone Sarah couldn't quite interpret. Was he worried about her past catching up with her? Or was he simply trying to understand how alone she truly was? "No. One's looking for me," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I burned those bridges when I married Thomas. My parents didn't approve of my choices. Their loss." The response was immediate and definitive, spoken with the conviction of someone who understood family rejection. "What about your husband's people? Thomas was an only child. His parents passed away several years ago." Sarah finished the last of her eggs and set down her fork. "It's just me and the baby now." Jake drained his coffee cup and set it in them wide. "Sink with the others. All right then. Let me show you that room, and we'll talk about what needs doing around here." The staircase was narrow and steep, its wooden steps creaking under their combined weight. Family photographs lined the walls, formal portraits of stern-faced ancestors, mixed with more casual snapshots of Jake and a woman who must have been Mary. She was petite and blonde, with laugh lines around her eyes and a smile that seemed to light up every picture. In the more recent photos, she appeared thinner, her smile more fragile, but still radiating a warmth that made Sarah understand why Jake grieved her so deeply. "This is it," Jake said, opening a door at the end of the hallway. The room was clearly feminine in its decoration, rose-colored wallpaper, white lace curtains, a dressing table with an oval mirror. But it felt frozen in time, as if whoever had lived here had simply vanished one day, leaving everything exactly as it was. A hairbrush sat on the dressing table, still threaded with blonde strands. A book lay open on the knitstand, a ribbon marking a page that would never be turned. "I can move Mary's things," Jake said quietly. "Pack them away somewhere. Only if you're ready to," Sarah replied. "I don't want to disturb anything that brings you comfort." Jake looked at her sharply, as if surprised by her understanding. "Most people think I should have cleared it out long ago. Say it's not healthy to keep a shrine. Most people haven't lost someone they couldn't imagine living without." Sarah moved to the window, looking out over the ranch grounds. Grief has its own timeline. No one else gets to set the schedule. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier awkwardness, deeper, more companionable. Jake cleared his throat and gestured toward a door in the corner. There's a washstand through there, and the water's good. Pumps connected to the well. After Jake left her to settle in, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and surveyed her new surroundings. The mattress was comfortable, the room spacious and bright, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was an intruder in someone else's carefully preserved sanctuary. Mary's presence lingered in every detail. The way the curtains were tied back, the arrangement of bottles on the dressing table, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed. But there was something else, too. As Sarah unpacked her few belongings into the empty drawers of the dresser, she began to notice inconsistencies that suggested the room hadn't been left entirely untouched. The dust on the dressing table was uneven, as if someone had moved items around recently. The book on the nightstand was positioned at an odd angle, as if it had been picked up and hastily replaced. Curiosity drew her to the dressing table, where she found herself studying the collection of bottles and jars that crowded its surface. Most were typical feminine toiletries: cold cream, rose water, lavender powder. But tucked behind a silver hand mirror was a small brown bottle with no label, containing what looked like pills or tablets. Sarah lifted the bottle carefully, noting its weight. Half full, perhaps, with white tablets that rattled softly when she shook it. She unscrewed the cap and sniffed delicately. The smell was faintly medicinal, bitter and chemical. Prescription medication, most likely, though the lack of a label made it impossible to identify. She was replacing the bottle when she noticed something else. A small jewelry box pushed far back into the corner of the dressing table, almost hidden behind the larger bottles. The wood was dark and polished, carved with intricate roses that matched the room's feminine aesthetic. The box opened with a soft creak, revealing a red velvet interior and several pieces of jewelry nestled in individual compartments. A pearl necklace, some earrings, a delicate gold bracelet. But what caught Sarah's attention was the empty space in the center compartment, a depression in the velvet that suggested something important had been removed. A wedding ring, perhaps, or another piece of jewelry, significant enough to warrant the prominent position. She was closing the box when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Jake's distinctive tread, measured and heavy. Sarah quickly stepped away from the dressing table, moving to the window as if she'd been admiring the view all along. "Thought you might want to see the garden space before it gets dark," Jake said from the doorway. "If you're serious about planting vegetables." "Absolutely." Sarah followed him back downstairs, but her mind remained on the mysteries she discovered in Mary's room. The unlabeled medication, the missing jewelry, the subtle signs that someone had been disturbing the carefully preserved space. The back porch offered a clear view of what had once been an impressive garden. Even in its current state of neglect, Sarah could see the bones of good design: raised beds arranged in geometric patterns, a greenhouse with most of its glass panes intact, fruit trees that still bore the remnants of this year's harvest. Mary laid all this out herself, Jake said, his voice carefully neutral. Read every gardening book she could get her hands on, corresponded with the county extension office, even drove to Austin to attend a conference on sustainable farming practices. She was ambitious. She was. Jake kicked at a clod of dirt with his boot, said we needed to be more self-sufficient, less dependent on store-bought food, especially if we ever. He stopped again, the familiar pattern of cutting himself off before revealing too much. But Sarah was beginning to understand the shape of the grief that haunted this place. Mary had been planning for a future that included children, a family to feed and nurture. The garden wasn't just about vegetables, it was about creating abundance, preparing for the life she and Jake had dreamed of building together. "The soil looks good," Sarah said, kneeling carefully to examine the earth. "Rich and dark. With some attention, this could be productive again." Mary composted everything: kitchen scraps, leaves, manure from the cattle. Built the soil up over years. Jake's voice carried a note of pride that seemed to surprise him. She had a whole system worked out, Sarah stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. Would you mind if I started small? Maybe clean up one of the beds and plant some winter vegetables? Things that can handle a frost? You planning to stay through winter? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Sarah met his gaze steadily. If you'll have me. My baby's due in October, and traveling with a newborn in winter weather. She let the sentence hang, allowing him to draw his own conclusions. About her vulnerability, Jake nodded slowly. We'll see how things go. But yes, you can work on the garden. There's tools in the greenhouse, and Mary kept detailed notes about what grows well here. As they walked back toward the house, Sarah found herself studying Jake's profile in the fading light. He was a handsome man, she realized, strong features weathered by sun and wind, dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, broad shoulders that spoke of physical strength. But there was a sadness about him that went deeper than simple grief, a weight that suggested secrets as well as loss. Jake, she said as they reached the porch steps, can I ask you something? He paused, his hand on the railing. Depends on what it is. Why did you say yes? When I told you my situation, why did you decide to help me? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. Because Mary would have. He looked out over the darkening landscape, his jaw tight. She had a soft spot for anyone in trouble, especially women. Used to drive me crazy sometimes, the strays she'd bring home. But she always said. He swallowed hard. She always said you never knew when helping someone might be the thing that saved your own soul. With that, he turned and went into the house, leaving Sarah alone on the porch with the weight of his words and the growing certainty that there was much more to Mary's story than a simple case of cancer and lost. As full darkness settled over the ranch, Sarah made her way back to Mary's room, her room now, she supposed, though it still felt like borrowing rather than claiming. She prepared for bed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, her movements careful and deliberate around the shrine-like arrangement of another woman's possessions. But before she turned out the light, she found herself drawn once more to the mysterious brown bottle on the dressing table. This time, she examined it more closely, looking for any clue to its contents or purpose. There was a number printed on the bottom, what might have been a lot number or manufacturing code, but nothing that identified the medication itself. As she prepared to replace the bottle, something rattled inside it that didn't sound quite like the pills. Sarah shook it gently, listening to the different sounds, the soft clicking of tablets. Yes, but also something harder, more metallic. Her curiosity overcoming her scruples, she appended the bottle into her palm. Among the white tablets, something gold caught the lamplight, a wedding ring, thin and delicate, with a small diamond that threw tiny rainbows against the walls. Mary's wedding ring, hidden among pills in an unlabeled bottle, removed from its proper place in the jewelry box. But why? Why hide a wedding ring among medication? Why remove it from its honored position among her other jewelry? Sarah stared at the ring for a long moment, then carefully returned everything to the bottle. Whatever secrets Mary Reeves had taken to her grave, they were more complex than the simple story of a beloved wife lost to cancer. And somehow, Sarah suspected, they were connected to the deep sadness that haunted Jake Reeves like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Sarah woke to the sound of horses whinnying in the distance and golden sunlight streaming through Mary's lace curtains. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts, the unfamiliar room, the comfortable bed, the absence of fear that had become her constant companion over the past weeks. Then memory flooded back, the ranch, Jake's unexpected kindness, the mysteries hidden in plain sight throughout this carefully preserved shrine. The baby was active this morning, rolling and stretching with what felt like increased urgency. Sarah pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the solid push of a foot or elbow against her ribs. Easy there, she whispered. We're safe now, at least for today. Downstairs, she found Jake's coffee pot still warm on the stove and a plate of biscuits covered with a clean dish towel. A note in bold handwriting was propped against the sugar bowl. "Gone to check the south pasture. Help yourself to breakfast. Back before noon." Jay, the simple courtesy of prepared food and an explanation of his whereabouts, touched something deep in Sarah's chest. When had anyone last considered her comfort enough to leave her a meal and peace of mind? Thomas, perhaps, in the early days of their marriage, when such gestures had seemed natural rather than precious. She ate slowly, savoring both the biscuits and the solitude. Through the kitchen window, she could see the neglected garden more clearly in the morning light. What had seemed overwhelming in yesterday's fading dusk now appeared merely challenging. The greenhouse drew her particular attention. Its glass panels caught the sun like a beacon, and she could see movement inside that suggested it wasn't entirely abandoned. After washing her plate and tidying the kitchen, Sarah made her way outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of mesquite and the distant lowing of cattle. Her pregnancy made walking more cumbersome than she'd anticipated, but the short journey to the greenhouse left her energized rather than exhausted. The door stuck slightly, swollen with moisture and disuse, but yielded to persistent pressure. Inside, Sarah discovered a wonderland of abandonment and survival. Tomato plants had grown wild and leggy, their vines twisting around support stakes in desperate spirals. Herb plants had self-seeded throughout the space, creating a chaotic carpet of basil, oregano, and what might have been cilantro. The air was thick and humid, perfumed with the green scent of unchecked growth, but it was the far corner of the greenhouse that stopped Sarah in her tracks. A small desk sat beneath a grimy window, its surface covered with notebooks, seed packets, and what appeared to be detailed garden plans drawn on graph paper. This had been Mary's command center, the place where she'd orchestrated her vision of agricultural abundance. Sarah approached the desk with reverence to a sacred space. The notebooks were filled with Mary's careful handwriting, planting schedules, weather observations, harvest records, and experimental notes about soil amendments and companion planting. The woman had been methodical to an extraordinary degree, recording not just what she'd planted and when, but also moon phases, temperature fluctuations, and the success rates of different varieties. One notebook was different from the others. Smaller, bound in leather rather than composition paper, and hidden beneath a stack of seed catalogs. Sarah hesitated before opening it, aware that she was crossing a line between casual curiosity and deliberate snooping. But something about the way it had been concealed suggested importance beyond mere gardening notes. The first entries were innocent enough. Observations about the ranch's microclimate, sketches of garden layouts, lists of heritage seed varieties Mary wanted to try. But as Sarah flipped deeper into the notebook, the tone shifted dramatically. March 15th. Jake doesn't know I've been to the doctor again. The headaches are getting worse, and there's something Dr. Morrison isn't telling me. I can see it in his eyes when he thinks I'm not looking. March 22nd. Test results came back. Dr. Morrison wants to refer me to a specialist in Austin. Jake will insist on coming, but I need to handle this myself first. Need to understand what we're facing before I break his heart. April 3rd. Oncologist confirmed what I suspected. Glioblastoma. 6 months if I'm lucky, maybe a year with treatment. Jake can never know I chose not to fight it. He'd blame himself, think he could have changed my mind, convinced me to try the chemo that would only buy me a few miserable months. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued reading. This wasn't just a garden journal, it was Mary's private confession, her documentation of a decision that had shaped everything that followed. April 10th. Told Jake the cancer was caught early, that surgery and treatment would likely cure it. The lie came so easily, but watching his face light up with hope was worth the deception. He needs to believe he's fighting alongside me, not watching me give up. April 18th. Started collecting the pills Dr. Morrison prescribed for pain. Not taking them as directed, saving them instead. When the time comes, I want it to be on my terms. Jake deserves to remember me as I am now, not as the hollow shell I'll become if this disease runs its course. The entries became increasingly sporadic as spring turned to summer, Mary's handwriting growing shakier and more difficult to read. But the pattern remained consistent: elaborate deceptions to hide her true prognosis from Jake, careful planning for an end she intended to control, and a love so fierce she was willing to bear her suffering alone rather than burden him with. Hopeless truth. July 4th, Independence Day. How fitting. Today I told Jake the treatment was working, that the latest scans showed improvement. He cried with relief. I held him and felt my heart break and mend simultaneously. This is love, protecting someone from the truth that would destroy them. August 15th. I've collected enough pills now. Hidden them in the brown bottle on my dressing table, mixed with the vitamins so Jake won't suspect. The headaches are constant now, and I'm losing time, moments where I'm not quite present. It's time to write my letters. Sarah's breath caught. Letters? What letters? She flipped through the remaining pages, but the entries stopped abruptly in mid-August. The rest of the notebook was blank except for a single line on the very last page, written in a different pen with handwriting that was barely recognizable as Mary's. Forgive me, my darling. This is not your fault. The greenhouse suddenly felt stifling. Sarah closed the notebook with shaking hands and stumbled outside, gasping in the fresh air. Mary hadn't died from cancer, at least not in the way Jake believed. She'd taken her own life using the pain medication she'd been stockpiling, choosing to end her suffering before it became unbearable and leaving Jake to believe her death was a natural progression of her disease. The wedding ring hidden among the pills made terrible sense now. Mary had removed it before taking the medication, perhaps unable to bear the weight of her marriage, vows while breaking the ultimate promise to love and honor in sickness and health. Or maybe she'd wanted to spare Jake the sight of it on her hand when he found her body. Sarah sank onto a wooden bench outside the greenhouse, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd discovered. Jake's grief wasn't just about losing his wife. It was compounded by guilt he didn't even know he should feel. Mary had orchestrated an elaborate deception to protect him from the truth of her choice, but in doing so, she'd left him with questions he couldn't answer and a sense of failure he couldn't name. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Jake was returning from the south pasture, sitting easy in the saddle of a paint horse that looked like it had been bred for cattle work. He spotted her near the greenhouse and changed direction, approaching with the alert posture of someone who'd noticed distress. You all right? He asked, swinging down from the horse with fluid grace. You look like you've seen a ghost. The irony of his words nearly broke Sarah's composure. She had seen a ghost, the ghost of a woman whose love had been so fierce and so misguided that it had poisoned the very thing she'd tried to protect. I was exploring the greenhouse, she managed. Found Mary's garden journals. She was incredibly thorough. Something flickered in Jake's expression, wariness perhaps, or pain. Mary documented everything. Said if she ever lost her memory, she wanted to be able to remember what worked and what didn't. She loved this place very much. She did. Jake tied his horse to a fence post and walked over to where Sarah sat. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the premature gray threading through his dark hair. Sometimes I think she loved it more than I did. She saw potential I couldn't imagine. Do you ever wonder? Sarah began, then stopped herself. This wasn't the time or place for the questions burning in her chest. Wonder what? If she had any. Regrets, about the treatment, about the choices she made when she got sick. Jake's face went carefully blank. Mary never had regrets about anything. She was the most decisive person I ever knew. When she made up her mind about something, that was it. No second guessing, no looking back. But there was something in his tone that suggested the opposite, that he'd wondered about Mary's choices, questioned decisions that had seemed strange even at the time. Sarah could see the doubt lurking beneath his loyalty, the questions he'd never allowed himself to ask. "Jake," she said carefully, "what was Mary like in those last weeks? Was she peaceful?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jake stared out over the neglected garden, his jaw working as if he was chewing on words too difficult to speak. "She was brave," he said finally. "Braver than anyone should have to be. But toward the end, she got secretive, like she was planning something she couldn't tell me about." He turned to look at Sarah directly. "Why are you asking?" Sarah felt the weight of Mary's hidden truth, pressing against her ribs like a physical burden. Jake deserved to know what his wife had really chosen, deserved to understand that her death hadn't been a failure of medicine or faith, but a deliberate act of love, however misguided. But she also understood why Mary had hidden the truth. The knowledge would destroy the man she'd died to protect. "No reason," Sarah lied, hating herself for the deception. I can see how much you loved each other." It must have been incredibly hard to watch her suffer. It was. Jake's voice was thick with emotion. "But we got through it together. She never gave up fighting, right until the end. That's what I hold on to, knowing she never stopped believing. We could beat it." The bitter irony of his words was almost unbearable. Mary had given up fighting, had chosen surrender over struggle, but she'd hidden that choice behind a performance of hope and determination that had convinced even the man who knew her best. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman." She was. Jake straightened, visibly pulling himself together. "I should get back to work. The fence in the east pasture needs mending, and there's a water trough that's been acting up." As he prepared to leave, Sarah made an impulsive decision. "Jake, would you mind if I spent some time in the greenhouse? Maybe started cleaning it up, getting it ready for fall planting?" "You sure you're up for that kind of work?" "Light work," she assured him. "Just organizing, maybe pulling some weeds. Nothing strenuous." Jake nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Help yourself." Mary would have liked knowing someone was taking care of her plants. After he rode away, Sarah returned to the greenhouse with a heavy heart. She needed to decide what to do with Mary's journal, with the devastating truth it contained. Destroying. It would protect Jake from knowledge that might destroy him, but keeping it felt like a betrayal of Mary's memory and a burden too heavy for her own conscience. She spent the rest of the morning pulling weeds and organizing the chaos of overgrown plants, but her mind kept returning to the leather notebook hidden beneath the seed catalogs. By afternoon, she'd made her decision. She would keep Mary's secret, but she would also keep the journal. Someday, when Jake was stronger, or when circumstances demanded it, the truth might need to be told. Until then, she would carry this burden, as Mary had carried her illness, alone and in silence. But as she worked among Mary's plants, Sarah began to understand something else about the woman who had created this space. A greenhouse wasn't just about growing food, it was about growing hope, about believing in futures that extended beyond immediate circumstances. Mary had planted seeds she knew she'd never see harvest, had planned gardens she'd never tend, all while carefully orchestrating her own death. It was an act of profound love and devastating selfishness, a choice that had saved Jake from watching her suffer while condemning him to a grief complicated by lies he didn't even know had been told. As the sun began to set, painting the greenhouse walls with golden light, Sarah made another decision. She would honor Mary's memory by bringing this place back to life, by fulfilling the dreams that had been cut short by cancer and complicated by impossible choices. But she would also, in her own way, try to heal the damage Mary's deception had done to the man she'd died to protect. It wouldn't be easy, and it might not even be possible. But sitting among the wild tomatoes and self-seeded herbs, feeling her baby move restlessly in her belly, Sarah understood that some kinds of healing required truth, even when that truth was harder to bear than the comfortable lies that had come before. The question was whether Jake Reeves was strong enough to handle the truth about the woman he'd loved enough to lose himself in grief, or whether he needed the protection Mary had died to provide. Time would tell. But for now, Sarah would tend Mary's plants and guard Mary's secrets, and hope that somehow, in the space between truth and mercy, she could find a way to help them both heal. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's discovery of Mary's journal, and the weight of that secret had settled into her bones like winter cold. She'd thrown herself into restoring the greenhouse and garden with an intensity that surprised even Jake, who watched her work with a mixture of admiration and concern. The baby had grown heavier, more demanding of space, making even simple tasks require careful planning and frequent rest. But the work gave her purpose and, more importantly, it gave her time to observe Jake without seeming intrusive. She'd begun to notice things, the way he avoided certain rooms in the house, how he never touched anything that had belonged to Mary, the careful distance he maintained from the life they'd built together. He was a man living like a guest in his own home, afraid to disturb the museum he'd created from his grief. This morning had started like the others, with Jake leaving early to tend cattle and Sarah settling into her routine of greenhouse work. But as she knelt among the tomato plants, carefully tying new growth to support stakes, she heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines, tires crunching on gravel, doors slamming with official authority. Through the greenhouse glass, she watched 3 cars pull up to the main house. The first was a sheriff's department cruiser, its star-emblazoned door catching the morning sun. The second was a dark sedan with government plates. The third was a pickup truck she didn't recognize, though the woman who climbed out of the driver's seat looked vaguely familiar. Blonde hair pulled back severely, expensive clothes that seemed out of place on a working ranch. Sarah's hands began to shake as she recognized the type of visit this represented. Official business. The kind that asked questions, demanded documentation, and rarely brought good news to people trying to start over with nothing but hope and desperation. Jake emerged from the barn, his posture immediately defensive as he took in the convoy of vehicles. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he approached the group of visitors. She couldn't hear the conversation, but body language told its own story. Jake's arms crossed, the woman gesturing emphatically. The sheriff standing with professional neutrality between potential conflict. 20 minutes later, Jake appeared at the greenhouse door, his face grim and his usual composure badly shaken. "Sarah," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "There are some people here who want to talk to you." Her stomach dropped. "What kind of people?" "Sheriff's Department, Social Services, and ... Jake paused, running a hand through his hair. "And someone who claims to be your sister-in-law." The world tilted slightly. Sarah gripped the edge of the potting bench to steady herself. "My sister-in-law?" "Victoria. Hartwell says she's Thomas's sister. Says she's been looking for you since the funeral." But that was impossible. Thomas had been an only child, he'd told her so repeatedly, had mourned his parents' death specifically because they'd left him with no family. Either he'd lied to her about something fundamental, or this woman was lying now for reasons Sarah couldn't begin to fathom. Jake, Thomas didn't have a sister. He was an only child. Something flickered in Jake's expression, doubt, perhaps, or recognition of the complexity that had just entered their carefully ordered world. "Well, this woman has legal documents that say otherwise. Birth certificates, marriage license with Thomas's name on it, death certificate. She's got lawyers with her and some very specific questions about what happened to Thomas's estate." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Thomas's estate consisted of debts and disappointment, but if someone was claiming to be his heir, if there were legal complications she hadn't anticipated, "I need to see her." "You sure about that?" You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. This is private property, and I can ask them to leave." The protective edge in Jake's voice surprised her. In 3 weeks, he'd shown her kindness, given her shelter and purpose. But this was something different, a willingness to stand between her and trouble, to use his authority as landowner to shield her from whatever storm had followed her to his doorstep. "No," Sarah said, though her voice trembled slightly. "If she's really Thomas's sister, I need to understand why he never mentioned her. And if she's not ... She touched her belly protectively. "I need to know what she wants." The walk from the greenhouse to the main house felt endless. Each step brought Sarah closer to a confrontation she didn't understand, with a woman who claimed connections to her dead husband that shouldn't exist. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing her distress, adding physical discomfort to her emotional turmoil. The group waited on the front porch. Sheriff Patterson, whom Sarah recognized from her brief time in Cedar Creek. A woman in a conservative suit who radiated social services authority. And the blonde woman from the pickup truck, whose expensive clothes and perfect makeup suggested money and confidence in equal measure. Victoria Hartwell was beautiful in the way that required significant investment, professionally styled hair, expertly applied cosmetics, clothing that probably cost more than Sarah had spent on necessities in the past month. But there was something cold about her beauty, something calculating in the way she assessed Sarah's appearance with obvious disdain. "So you're the woman who's been impersonating my brother's widow," Victoria said without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I beg your pardon?" Sarah's voice came out stronger than she felt. "My brother Thomas James Hartwell died in a car accident 4 months ago, leaving behind significant debts and a wife who disappeared before his estate could be properly settled. You've been using his name, claiming to be his widow, but I have reason to believe you're nothing more than a fraud who's taking advantage of good people, like Mr. Reeves here." Jake stepped slightly closer to Sarah, his presence both protective and steadying. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you're talking to, but Sarah's been nothing but honest with me about her situation." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. Has she told you about the insurance policies? The pension benefits she's not entitled to claim? The property in Dallas that she abandoned without paying the taxes? "That property was foreclosed," Sarah said, finding her voice. "And Thomas didn't have any insurance policies that paid out. The investigator made that very clear." "Oh, my dear," Victoria's tone turned patronizing. "There were several policies. Life insurance, disability, even a small pension from his accounting firm. All payable to his legal widow, which you most certainly are not." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hartwell, Victoria Hartwell, has documentation suggesting she's the rightful heir to Thomas Hartwell's estate. She's also raised questions about identity fraud and benefit theft that my department is obligated to investigate." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "I don't understand. Thomas was an only child. He told me so himself, many times. He mourned being alone in the world after his parents died." "My brother was a troubled man," Victoria said, her voice softening slightly in what might have been genuine sadness. "We'd been estranged for years after a family dispute. He apparently chose to pretend I didn't exist rather than deal with the complications of our relationship. But he married me," Sarah said desperately. "We had a wedding, a marriage license, a life together. You can't just claim those things didn't happen." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. "Can't I? Show me your marriage certificate. Show me any legal documentation that proves you were actually married to my brother." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. The marriage certificate had been in the house when it was foreclosed, along with all their other important papers. She'd been so focused on gathering necessities, clothes, a few precious mementos, Thomas's mother's ring, that she'd never thought to secure. Legal documentation of their relationship. It was in the house, she whispered. Everything was in the house when the bank ... How convenient, Victoria said. No marriage certificate, no legal proof of your relationship, no documentation of your right to claim widowhood. From where? I stand, you're just a woman who moved in with my troubled brother and disappeared when he died, leaving his legitimate family to clean up the mess. A social services woman stepped forward, her voice professionally gentle. Mrs. Sarah, I'm Linda Morrison from Child Protective Services. Given the questions about your legal status and the concerns Mrs. Hartwell has raised about your financial stability, we need to discuss the welfare of your unborn child. My baby is fine, Sarah said, her hand moving protectively to her belly. I'm healthy, I have prenatal care. I'm not using drugs or alcohol. There's no reason for CPS involvement. Perhaps not, Linda Morrison agreed. But living on the charity of strangers, claiming benefits you may not be entitled to, traveling without proper documentation, these are all factors we have to consider when assessing the safety and stability of a child's environment. Jake's voice cut through the mounting tension like a blade. Now hold on just a minute. Sarah's not living on charity. She's working here, earning her keep by taking care of things that need doing. And she's not claiming any benefits or causing any trouble. She's a pregnant woman who needed help, and I provided it. Last I checked, that wasn't a crime in Texas. Of course not, Mr. Reeves, Sheriff Patterson said diplomatically. But Mrs. Victoria Hartwell has filed a formal complaint alleging identity theft and fraud. We have to investigate those allegations, regardless of anyone's personal feelings about the situation. Sarah felt trapped, cornered by accusations she couldn't refute and implications she couldn't escape. The worst part was the grain of truth in Victoria's claims. She couldn't prove her marriage to Thomas, couldn't document her right to call herself his widow, couldn't even prove she was who she claimed to be without the papers that had been lost in the foreclosure. What do you want? Sarah asked Victoria directly. What's the point of all this? If Thomas had insurance money or pension benefits, take them. I never knew they existed. I never tried to claim anything I wasn't entitled to. Oh. What I want, Victoria said, her voice hardening again, is for you to stop using my family's name. Stop claiming a relationship to my brother that may never have existed. And stop taking advantage of good people who don't know any better. The baby, Sarah said suddenly, the realization hitting her like lightning. I can prove I was married to Thomas. The baby will have his DNA when it's born. A paternity test will prove Thomas was the father, and that would only be possible if we were in a relationship. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. DNA tests can prove paternity, certainly, but they can't prove marriage. For all anyone knows, you could have been his mistress, his casual girlfriend, or someone who seduced him for money. Pregnancy isn't proof of legitimacy. The cruelty of this statement took Sarah's breath away. This woman was systematically destroying not just her legal claims, but her personal dignity, reducing her relationship with Thomas to something sordid and calculated. You didn't know him, Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger now rather than fear. Thomas wasn't the kind of man who had casual relationships or mistresses. He was decent, faithful, loving. Whatever family dispute you had with him, whatever estrangement existed between you, don't you dare diminish what we had together. What you had together, Victoria repeated mockingly, was apparently so meaningful that he never mentioned you to anyone who mattered. His employer didn't know he was married. His neighbors didn't know he had a wife. His bank accounts and insurance policies all listed me as his emergency contact and beneficiary. Each revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas had kept their marriage secret from his professional life, had maintained emergency contacts that excluded her entirely, had made financial arrangements that suggested he'd never updated his records to reflect their relationship. But why? What reason could he have had for keeping her separate from the official documentation of his life? Jake's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. This is all very interesting, but I don't see what it has to do with Sarah's current situation. Even if there are questions about her legal status, she's not hurting anyone. She's working hard, taking care of herself and her baby, and helping me get my ranch back in order. Unless she's committed an actual crime, I don't see grounds for removing her from my property. The crime, Victoria said smoothly, is identity theft. Using my brother's name to gain sympathy, accepting charity under false pretenses, potentially filing fraudulent claims for benefits she's not entitled to receive. I never filed any claims, Sarah protested. I never asked for anything except work and a place to stay. I've been completely honest about my situation. Have you? Victoria's smile was razor sharp. Because my investigation suggests Thomas Hartwell was never married to anyone named Sarah. There's no record of the wedding you claim took place, no documentation of the relationship you describe. Either you're delusional, or you're a con artist who's gotten very good at playing the grieving widow. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt the world tilting around her, reality becoming uncertain. Could she have been wrong about her own marriage? Could there have been some legal flaw, some oversight that invalidated what she'd believed was real? But no, she remembered the ceremony, small as it was. Justice of the peace in Dallas, 2 witnesses. From the street, Thomas nervous in his best suit and her in a simple white dress from the department store. They'd exchanged rings, signed papers, kissed when the judge pronounced them married. Unless there had been something wrong with the paperwork. Some procedural error that invalidated the ceremony without their knowledge. I need to make some phone calls, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to contact the court where we were married, get copies of the documentation. Good luck with that, Victoria said. I already tried. There's no record of any marriage between Thomas Hartwell and anyone matching your description. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt Jake's eyes on her, could sense his confusion and growing doubt. How could she explain something she didn't understand herself? How could she defend a truth that seemed to be dissolving before her eyes? Sheriff Patterson cleared his throat. Mrs. Dot. Sarah, I'm going to need you to come down to the station for questioning. These are serious allegations, and we need to sort out the facts before this goes any further. She's not going anywhere without a lawyer, Jake said firmly. And she's certainly not traveling in her condition unless it's absolutely necessary. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Reeves, but this is official business. These allegations need to be investigated properly. As the argument continued around her, Sarah found herself thinking about Thomas, about the man she'd loved and married and lost. Had their entire relationship been built on lies? Had he been protecting her from something? Or protecting himself? And if Victoria was telling the truth about the insurance money and pension benefits, why had Thomas left her to face foreclosure and homelessness when there were resources available to prevent it? The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the stress and confusion surrounding its existence. Sarah pressed her hand to the spot, drawing strength from the solid reality of life growing inside her. Whatever complicated truths existed about her relationship with Thomas, whatever legal technicalities might invalidate her claims to widowhood, one thing remained certain. She was carrying his child, and that gave her a right to answers that no one else could take away. I'll come to the station, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the heated discussion between Jake and the sheriff. But I want legal representation, and I want answers. If my marriage to Thomas wasn't legal, I need to understand why. If there are insurance benefits or pension money, I need to know why I was never told about them. And if this woman is really his sister, I need to understand why he spent 5 years telling me he had no family left in the world. Victoria's confident. Expression flickered slightly, as if Sarah's calm acceptance of the situation wasn't what she'd expected. "Fine, get your lawyer. Get your answers. But when this is all sorted out, I expect you to stop using my family's name and stop making claims you can't substantiate. And I expect you to prove you're who you claim to be," Sarah replied, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Because if you really are Thomas's sister, if you really cared about him, then you would have been there when he needed you. You would have known about his struggles, his debts, his depression. You would have prevented the desperation that killed him." The accusation hit its mark. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, revealing something that might have been guilt. "Or pain. You don't know anything about our family situation." "No," Sarah agreed, "I don't. But I'm going to find out. And when I do, we're going to have a very different conversation about who belonged in Thomas's life and who abandoned him when he needed them most." As the official vehicles prepared to leave with Sarah in custody for questioning, Jake approached her with something that looked like a business card. "Best lawyer in 3 counties, he said quietly. "Tell him I sent you, and that I'll stand good for his fees. Whatever's going on here, whatever the truth turns out to be, you're going to face it with proper representation." The gesture broke something loose in Sarah's chest. "Jake, you don't owe me anything." "You've already done more than I owe you plenty," he interrupted. "These past weeks, watching you bring life back to Mary's garden, seeing you work despite everything you're going through, you've reminded me what it means to fight for something that matters. Now let me fight for you." As Sarah was helped into the back of the sheriff's cruiser, she looked back at the ranch that had become her sanctuary. Jake stood on the porch, watching her leave with an expression that mixed determination and something that might have been more than mere compassion. Whatever truths awaited her in the town's questioning rooms and legal offices, whatever revelations would emerge about Thomas and Victoria and the tangled web of family secrets, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would return to this place. She would fight for the life she'd begun to build here, for the safety she'd found in Jake's quiet strength, and for the future she was determined to create for her unborn child. The ranch disappeared behind them as the cruiser headed toward Cedar Creek, but its promise remained: a place where broken people could heal, where secrets could be faced and overcome, and where love could grow in the spaces between truth and forgiveness. The Cedar Creek Police Station was a small, weathered building that smelled of coffee and old paperwork. Sarah sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair across from Sheriff Patterson's desk, her hands folded over her belly while Jake's lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Robert Chun, reviewed documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades untangling legal complexities. 3 hours had passed since her arrival. 3 hours of questions, phone calls, and the slow, painstaking process of reconstructing a life that seemed to be dissolving under scrutiny. The baby had been restless throughout, pressing against her bladder and ribs as if protesting the stress that radiated through her body. "The marriage license was issued," Chun said finally, setting down a stack of papers he'd obtained through various official channels. "Dallas County Courthouse, March 15th, 5 years ago. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison to Thomas James Hartwell, performed by Justice of the Peace Harold Whitman." Sheriff Patterson leaned forward. "But Mrs. Victoria Hartwell said there was no record." "Mrs. Victoria Hartwell was looking in the wrong place," Chun interrupted smoothly. "She searched under Sarah Hartwell, but the original license was issued under Sarah's maiden name. The marriage is completely legal and properly documented." Sarah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "So I really am his widow." "I wasn't delusional or confused. You are absolutely his legal widow," Chun confirmed. "Which brings us to the more interesting question. Why did Victoria Hartwell go to such lengths to suggest otherwise?" Chun opened another folder, this one thick with financial documents and legal papers. Thomas Hartwell did indeed have life insurance policies and pension benefits. 3 policies totaling nearly $200,000, plus accumulated pension funds worth approximately $50,000 more. The numbers hit Sarah like physical blows. $250,000, enough to have prevented the foreclosure, enough to have secured her future and her child's future, enough to have changed everything. But the insurance investigator told me the policies wouldn't pay out, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He said Thomas's blood alcohol level meant it was suicide, and suicide voids the policies. That would be true, Chun agreed, if Thomas had actually been drinking. But according to the toxicology report I obtained this morning, the alcohol in his system came from a different source entirely. Sheriff Patterson sat up straighter. What kind of different source? Chun spread out several medical documents across the desk. Thomas Hartwell was diabetic, a condition he'd been managing with insulin injections for several years. On the night he died, his blood sugar dropped to dangerously low levels, a condition called hypoglycemia that can cause confusion, disorientation, and behavior that mimics intoxication. Sarah's world tilted again, but this time toward understanding. Rather than confusion, the bourbon bottle in his truck ... was planted there after the accident, Chun said grimly. The alcohol found in Thomas's bloodstream was introduced post-mortem, most likely to create the appearance of drunk driving and void the insurance policies. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what Chun was revealing. Thomas hadn't killed himself. He'd been murdered, killed by someone who wanted to steal the insurance money that should have protected his widow and child. Victoria, Sarah breathed. Victoria Hartwell stands to inherit everything if you're deemed an illegitimate widow. Chun confirmed. She filed paperwork 3 months ago claiming to be Thomas's sole surviving heir, citing estrangement from his supposed wife as grounds for assuming his estate had no valid claimant. Sheriff Patterson was already reaching for his radio. We need to bring her back in for questioning. If this is true, we're looking at murder and insurance fraud. It gets worse, Chun continued. I did some digging into Victoria Hartwell's background. Her real name is Victoria Sanderson, and she's not related to Thomas at all. She's a professional con artist who specializes in identity theft and inheritance fraud. She's been watching obituaries, looking for recent widowers with substantial estates and complicated family situations. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't Thomas's sister at all. She was a predator who'd killed him for money and then terrorized his genuine widow to cover her tracks. How did she know about the insulin? Sarah asked. How did she know enough about Thomas's medical condition to use it against him? Chun's expression grew even grimmer. Because she'd been watching him for months, learning his routines, his vulnerabilities. Thomas's diabetes wasn't a secret. He managed it carefully, but he wasn't hiding it. Anyone who spent time observing him would have noticed the insulin injections, the careful attention to his diet and blood sugar levels. She stalked him, Sarah said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. She learned everything about him, about us, and then she killed him when she was ready to claim his money. And when you proved harder to locate than she expected, she came. Looking for you herself, Sheriff Patterson added. Probably figured she'd intimidate you into disappearing permanently, or discredit you enough that her inheritance claim would go unchallenged. Sarah pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her. Her child would never know its father, but at least now she understood that Thomas hadn't chosen to leave them. He'd been taken from them by a stranger's greed. Murdered by someone who saw his life as nothing more than a financial opportunity. What happens now? She asked. Now we arrest Victoria Sanderson for murder and fraud, Sheriff Patterson said, standing and reaching for his hat. And you get to go home to Jake Reeves' ranch with a clear conscience and $250,000 in insurance money. The word home hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. The ranch had become home over the past weeks, more than any place she'd lived. Since childhood. Not just because of the safety it represented, but because of Jake, his quiet strength, his gentle kindness, the way he'd stood between her and trouble without asking for anything in return. "Sheriff," she said as Patterson prepared to leave, "when you arrest Victoria, will she know it was me who exposed her? Why does that matter? Because she's dangerous. Because she killed one person to get money, and she might kill again to avoid prison. Jake Reeves protected me when he didn't have to, gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. I won't be responsible for putting him in danger." Chun closed his folders and stood. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're not responsible for Victoria Sanderson's choices or actions. She created this situation with her greed and violence. But if you're concerned about safety, I can arrange for additional security at the ranch until she's in custody." As they prepared to leave the police station, Sarah found herself thinking about this strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. If she hadn't lost the house, if she hadn't been forced onto the highways with nothing but desperation and determination, if she hadn't found Jake's ranch... Victoria might have succeeded in her elaborate fraud. The insurance money would have disappeared into accounts that had nothing to do with Thomas or his memory, and his real killer would have vanished with her stolen fortune. But Sarah had survived, had found sanctuary with a grieving widower who understood loss, and had uncovered the truth that would bring justice for Thomas and security for their child. It felt like more than coincidence. It felt like Thomas himself had somehow guided her to safety and toward the revelation that would clear his name. The drive back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence. Chun had insisted on accompanying her, both for legal consultation and for protection until Victoria was apprehended. As they turned through the wrought iron gates, Sarah saw Jake emerge from the barn, his face tight with worry that transformed into relief when he saw her in the passenger seat. "Thank God," he said, reaching to help her out of the car. "I've been going out of my mind wondering what was happening." "It's over," Sarah said, allowing herself to lean into his strength for a moment. "Victoria isn't Thomas's sister. She's a con artist who killed him for the insurance money." Jake's arms tightened around her protectively. "Jesus, are you all right? Is the baby... We're fine." "Better than fine, actually." Sarah pulled back to look at him directly. "Jake, Thomas left insurance money. A lot of it. Enough that I won't need to depend on your charity anymore." Something flickered in Jake's expression, not relief, as she'd expected, but something that might have been disappointment. "So you'll be leaving then, moving on to start your new life?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah realized that somewhere in the weeks of working side by side, sharing meals and comfortable silences, watching him slowly begin to heal while she found her own strength, she'd stopped thinking about leaving. The ranch had become more than a sanctuary. It had become home in a way her house with Thomas never quite had. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked quietly. "I want you to do whatever makes you happy," Jake said. But his voice carried undertones that suggested his personal preferences might be different from his diplomatic words. Chung cleared his throat. "Diplomatically, I should mention that the insurance settlement will take some time to process. Even with clear evidence of fraud and murder, these things move slowly through the legal system. You're looking at several months before the money is actually available." "Months," Sarah repeated, then looked at Jake with something that might have been hope. "I suppose I'll need somewhere to stay until then. Somewhere safe, where I can have the baby and figure out what comes next." Jake's smile was soft and genuine. "I think I know a place. Good grazing land, reliable water, solid infrastructure when it's properly maintained. Could use someone who knows about vegetable gardening and isn't afraid of hard work." "Sounds perfect," Sarah said. "What's the rent?" "Oh, I don't think rent will be necessary. The owner's got a soft spot for anyone in trouble, especially pregnant women who remind him what it means to fight for something that matters." As Chun prepared to leave, promising to call when Victoria was in custody and to begin the process of claiming Thomas's insurance benefits, Sarah found herself alone with Jake on the front porch. The afternoon sun was setting behind the mesquite. Trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that made the ranch look like something from a dream. "Jake," she said carefully, "there's something else I need to tell you. Something I discovered about Mary." His expression immediately shuddered. "Sarah, I don't think. She didn't die the way you think she did." The words came out in a rush before courage could desert her. "I found her journal in the greenhouse. Mary chose when and how she died. She'd been stockpiling pain medication, planning to take her own life before the cancer could run its course." Jake went very still. "That's not possible. Mary fought until the end. She never gave up." "She fought to protect you from knowing what she'd chosen," Sarah said gently. "She loved you so much that she was willing to die alone with her secret rather than burden you with the knowledge that she'd given up fighting." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of grief and guilt that had been built on a foundation of loving deception. Jake stared out over the ranch Mary had loved, his jaw working as if he was trying to swallow words too painful to speak. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Because you deserve to know the truth. Because you've been carrying guilt. That isn't yours to carry. Mary's choice wasn't a reflection of your failure or your inadequacy as a husband. It was her last act of love, protecting you from watching her suffer through the worst of her illness." Jake's hands gripped the porch, railing so tightly his knuckles went white. "She should have told me. We should have faced it together. Maybe, but she made a different choice based on love and fear and the desire to spare you additional pain. It wasn't the choice you would have made, but it was hers to make. And you think I should just accept that? Forgive her for lying to me about something so fundamental?" Sarah moved closer, not touching him but offering her presence as comfort. "I think you should understand that love sometimes makes people do impossible things. Mary lied to you because telling the truth would have destroyed you both. Just like Thomas never told me about his diabetes because he didn't want me to worry about something he thought he could manage alone." The parallel seemed to register with Jake. Both their spouses had died keeping secrets meant to protect the people they loved, secrets that had caused additional pain when discovered after the fact. "The insulin," Jake said quietly. "Thomas's killer used his medical condition against him. Yes, if I'd known about the diabetes, if Thomas had trusted me with that information, I might have been able to help him manage it better. I might have noticed something was wrong that night. But he was trying to be strong, trying not to burden me with his health concerns." Jake was quiet for a long time, processing the weight of revelation and parallel loss. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Mary's wedding ring. I could never understand why she'd taken it off before she died. I thought maybe the cancer had made her fingers swell, or that she was too weak to wear jewelry. But she took it off because she couldn't bear to break her wedding vows while wearing the symbol of them. She loved you, Jake. Everything she did was motivated by love, even when that love led her to make choices that hurt you both. And Thomas loved you," Jake replied, "even when his protective instincts led him to keep secrets that might have saved his life." As darkness settled over the ranch, they sat together on the porch steps, two people who'd been shaped by loss and deception, but who'd found their way to understanding and acceptance. The baby moved restlessly in Sarah's belly, reminding her that life continued beyond grief, that hope could grow even in the spaces carved out by pain. "Sarah," Jake said eventually, "when your insurance money comes through, when you have the resources to go anywhere and do anything, what do you think you'll want?" The question was casual in tone, but weighted with significance. Sarah understood. He was really asking whether she saw a future that included him, whether the connection they'd built was strong enough to survive the restoration of her independence. "I think," she said carefully, I want to finish what Mary started in that garden. I think I'll want to raise my child in a place where love grows strong enough to weather any storm. And I think I'll want to do it with someone who understands that sometimes the most important things in life are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. Jake turned to look at her directly, hope and vulnerability warring in his expression. That sounds like something worth building a life around. It does, Sarah agreed. The only question is whether you're ready to build something new, or if you're still too committed to preserving what you've lost. The answer came not in words, but in action. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object that caught the porch light. A simple gold band, worn smooth with years of wear. "This was my grandfather's wedding ring," he said. "He gave it to my father, who gave it to me when I married Mary. She always said it should go to the woman who'd help me build a future worth having." Sarah's breath caught. "Jake ... I'm not asking you to marry me," he said quickly. "Not yet anyway. But I'm asking if you'd consider staying. Not just until the baby comes, not just until the insurance money arrives, but permanently. As my partner in rebuilding this ranch, in creating something new from what we've both lost." The ring lay warm in her palm, solid and real and full of promise. What about Mary? What about honoring her memory? "Mary's gone," Jake said with quiet finality. "I'll always love her, always carry the good memories. But she's gone, and I'm still here. You're still here. And this baby deserves a father who can love its mother the way she deserves to be loved." Sarah looked out over the ranch that had become her sanctuary, thought about the garden she'd begun to restore, and the life she was carrying, and the man beside her who'd shown her what it meant to be protected and valued. The future stretched ahead like an unplanted field, full of potential and possibility. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll stay. We'll build something beautiful here." As Jake slipped his grandfather's ring onto her finger, Sarah felt the last pieces of her old life finally settle into place. Thomas was gone but vindicated. His killer would face justice, and his child would grow up knowing the truth about the father who'd loved them, both enough to try to protect them from his own vulnerabilities. The ranch stretched around them in the darkness, full of promise and new beginnings, while somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang its complex song of borrowed melodies and original music, weaving old themes into something entirely new. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in the doorway of what had once been Mary's room, watching October sunlight stream through windows she'd opened wide to let in the crisp autumn air. The space looked different now, not because she'd removed Mary's belongings, which remained respectfully arranged on the dressing table and in the closet, but because she'd added her own touches. A rocking chair sat near the window where she could look out over the garden while nursing the baby that was due any day. Fresh flowers from the greenhouse brightened the dresser, and the scent of lavender sachets she'd sewn herself filled the air with warmth and comfort. The transformation hadn't been about erasing Mary's presence, but about creating space for new life alongside cherished memories. Jake had helped her understand that honoring the past didn't require freezing it in time. Sometimes the greatest tribute to someone's memory was allowing their legacy to grow and change and nurture future generations. The sound of hammering drew her attention to the window. Below in the yard, Jake was working with 2 men from town to expand the front porch, adding a section that would accommodate the baby stroller and the outdoor furniture they'd ordered for next spring. The insurance money from Thomas's policies had finally arrived the week before, and Sarah had insisted on using part of it to improve the ranch infrastructure rather than simply keeping it as personal security. "It's not my money," she'd told Jake when he'd protested that she should save it for her own future. "It's blood money that cost Thomas his life. The only way to honor his memory is to use it for something that creates life and happiness instead of death and greed." So they'd planned improvements together, a new greenhouse section for year-round growing, repairs to the barn and outbuildings, modern safety features for the house, and a college fund for the baby that would ensure Thomas's child would never face the kind of financial desperation that had driven Sarah to the highway with nothing but hope and determination. Victoria Sanderson had been sentenced to life in prison without parole the previous month, her elaborate fraud scheme unraveling completely once investigators began pulling at the threads Sarah and Robert Chun had exposed. The trial had been difficult but cathartic, forcing Sarah to relive Thomas's death while simultaneously providing closure and justice. Victoria had shown no remorse, even when confronted with evidence of her methodical stalking and murder, treating the entire proceeding as an inconvenience, rather than a reckoning for taking a man's life. But the trial had also revealed something unexpected. Thomas had been planning to surprise Sarah with news of his life insurance policies on their 5th wedding anniversary, just 2 weeks after his death. He'd been secretly meeting with financial advisors, learning about investment strategies and estate planning, preparing to secure their future before starting the family they both wanted. His diabetes management had been part of that same planning. He'd been working with specialists to optimize his treatment, ensuring he'd be healthy enough to be an active father well into old age. The revelation had broken Sarah's heart and healed it simultaneously. Thomas's secrets hadn't been about protecting himself, but about protecting their dreams, ensuring that when he finally told her about his condition and his preparations for their future, he could present solutions rather than problems. His death had interrupted that careful planning, but his love had still managed to provide for the family he'd never lived to see. A sharp contraction pulled Sarah from her memories, stronger than the practice contractions that had been coming and going for days. She pressed her hand to her belly, breathing through the sensation and timing its duration. 45 seconds, intense enough to make her pause, but not overwhelming. The baby was definitely getting ready to make its entrance into the world. "Jake," she called down to the porch, keeping her voice calm but loud enough to carry over the hammering. He looked up immediately, his expression shifting to alert concern when he saw her posture. "Time? Maybe. The contractions are getting stronger." Jake was already climbing down from the ladder, pulling off his work gloves and heading for the house. "I'll get the truck started. Hospital bags are already packed, right?" Sarah smiled at his controlled urgency. They'd been through this routine twice before, false alarms that had sent them racing to the hospital in Cedar Creek, only to be told the baby wasn't quite ready yet. But Dr. Martinez had warned them that third babies often came faster than first ones, and Sarah's due date had technically passed 3 days ago. Another contraction hit as Jake reached the porch, this one strong, enough to make her grip the doorframe for support. Definitely not false labor this time. "Okay," she said when it passed. "I think this is really it." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Jake's careful preparations paid off. The truck was gassed and ready. The hospital bag contained everything they might need, and he'd already called Dr. Martinez to alert the hospital staff. Sarah found herself grateful for his methodical nature, the same attention to detail that had built this ranch into something beautiful and sustainable. The drive to Cedar Creek was remarkably peaceful despite the circumstances. Contractions came regularly, but not overwhelmingly, and Sarah had time to appreciate the landscape rolling past the windows, autumn colors painting the mesquite trees, cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that showed signs of careful management, farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys as families prepared for winter. "Nervous?" Jake asked, glancing over at her as they passed the town limits. "Excited," Sarah replied honestly. "This baby has been through so much already, losing its father, homelessness, cross-country traveling, murder investigations, legal battles. I think it's ready to be born into a world where it's safe and wanted and loved." "It will be," Jake said with quiet certainty. "More love than it could possibly imagine." Cedar Creek Hospital was small but modern, and Dr. Martinez met them at the entrance with a wheelchair and the kind of calm competence that made everything seem manageable. Sarah had been seeing him regularly since Jake's insurance had kicked in, and she trusted him completely to bring her baby safely into the world. The labor progressed quickly once they reached the delivery room. Sarah had worried about giving birth without female relatives present, about missing the support network that should have surrounded such an important moment. But Jake proved to be everything she needed: steady, encouraging, present in a way that felt both natural and profound. When the most intense contractions hit, his voice guided her through breathing techniques he'd researched online. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, his presence reminded her of the strength she'd already proven she possessed. And when their daughter finally arrived, screaming with indignation at being removed from her warm, dark sanctuary, Jake was the first to whisper words of welcome to the newest member of their unconventional family. "She's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion as Dr. Martinez placed the baby on Sarah's chest. "Look at all that dark hair. And those lungs, definitely going to be able to call the cattle home from the far pasture." Sarah laughed through tears of exhaustion and joy, studying the tiny face that would grow to look like Thomas, but would know Jake as the only father she'd ever remember. The baby's eyes were dark and alert, taking in this bright new world with a kind of serious expression that suggested she understood the gravity of finally arriving at her destination. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered. "Welcome to your life." They discussed names during the long evenings of waiting, agreeing that the baby should carry something of Thomas's legacy while also representing the new beginning they were building together. If it had been a boy, they'd planned to use Thomas as a middle name. But she was definitely, unmistakably female, with delicate features and tiny fingers that gripped Sarah's with surprising strength. "Grace," Sarah said suddenly, the name feeling right the moment she spoke it. "Grace Elizabeth Hartwell Reeves." Jake's eyes brightened. "Grace, that's perfect. She certainly came to us by grace." Dr. Martinez finished his examinations and pronounced both mother and daughter healthy and strong. "She's a good size, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Good color, strong reflexes, excellent lung capacity as we've all heard. I'd say she's ready to go home whenever you are." "Home," Sarah repeated, word carrying weight it had never held before. Not just a place to sleep or shelter from storms, but a true home built on love and shared purpose, and the kind of commitment that weather any challenge. They stayed in the hospital overnight for observation, but both Sarah and Grace were eager to begin their real life together. Jake had converted the room next to theirs into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and assembling furniture with the same careful attention he brought to all his projects. Sarah's rocking chair had been moved there, positioned near the window where she could look out over the garden while nursing Grace and planning for spring planting. The drive back to the ranch was even more peaceful than the journey to the hospital. With Grace sleeping contentedly in her car seat and October sunshine warming the truck cab, Sarah found herself noticing details she'd overlooked before: the way the morning light caught the dewdrops on fence posts, the graceful movements of cattle as they grazed in distant pastures, the solid presence of the ranch buildings growing larger as they approached home. Charlie Morrison was waiting for them at the gate, his weathered face creased in an enormous grin as he caught sight of the baby carrier. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, then immediately apologized for his language. "Sorry, ma'am. Well, I'll be blessed. That's one beautiful baby." "Charlie, meet Grace Elizabeth," Jake said proudly, carefully lifting the carrier from the FIU truck. "Grace, this is Charlie Morrison, the man who brought your mama to us when she needed help most." Charlie's eyes grew suspiciously bright as he peered at the sleeping infant. "She's got good timing, this one. Born just when the weather's perfect for bringing new life into the world." As they approached the main house, Sarah was surprised to see several vehicles parked in the yard: Martha Pemberton's sedan, Dr. Martinez's truck, and a few others she didn't immediately recognize. Jake caught her puzzled expression and smiled mysteriously. "I might have mentioned to a few people that we were expecting good news today," he admitted. "Martha insisted on organizing a welcome home gathering. Nothing big, just some folks who've been rooting for you since you first arrived in Cedar Creek." The front door opened before they could knock, revealing Martha Pemberton with flour on her apron and joy radiating from every feature. "There she is. There's our miracle baby." The house had been transformed while they were gone. Flowers filled every surface, a welcome home banner hung across the kitchen doorway, and the dining room table groaned under the weight of covered dishes and casseroles that represented weeks of meals Sarah wouldn't have to worry about preparing while adjusting to motherhood. "Martha, this is too much," Sarah protested, though her voice carried more gratitude than complaint. "Nonsense," Martha replied briskly. "This baby represents hope for everyone in Cedar Creek. We've all been waiting to celebrate her arrival properly." Dr. Martinez approached Linda Morrison from Child Protective Services, who'd become an unexpected ally during the investigation into Victoria's fraud. "I hope you don't mind the surprise," Linda said, "but I wanted to officially close your case file with good news for once. Grace is clearly thriving, you have a stable home environment, and there are no remaining concerns about your ability to provide excellent care." The gesture meant more than Linda probably realized. Sarah's encounters with social services had been traumatic reminders of how precarious her situation had become, how close she'd come to losing everything that mattered. Having those same officials celebrate her success felt like a validation of every difficult choice she'd made during her journey, from desperation to stability. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself surrounded by a community she hadn't known she was building. Mrs. Kowalski from the boarding house brought homemade bread and stories about her own children's births decades earlier. The general store clerk who'd watched her suspiciously during her first desperate visit to Cedar Creek now cooed over Grace with genuine affection. Even Sheriff Patterson stopped by with a stuffed teddy bear and news that Victoria's appeals had been denied, ensuring she'd remain in prison for the rest of her life. But the most meaningful moment came when Robert Chun arrived with a manila envelope thick with legal documents. "I have some news that couldn't wait," he announced, his usually professional demeanor brightened by obvious satisfaction. He spread the papers across the kitchen table while everyone gathered around. "Thomas's estate has been completely settled. The insurance companies have not only paid out the full benefits, but have also provided additional compensation for the delays and emotional distress caused by Victoria's interference. More importantly, I've been working with federal prosecutors on a civil forfeiture case against Victoria's other fraudulent activities." Sarah frowned, not understanding the implications. "What does that mean?" "It means Victoria had been running similar scams for years, stealing from dozens of grieving families across multiple states. When she's convicted, which is certain, all her assets will be distributed to her victims. Based on the evidence, Thomas's estate is entitled to receive approximately $300,000 in additional compensation." The number was staggering. Combined with the insurance money, Sarah would have more than enough to secure Grace's future while also investing in the ranch improvements they dreamed about. More than financial security, though, the settlement represented justice for all of Victoria's victims, acknowledgement that their grief and loss mattered. "There's one more thing," Chun continued, pulling out a final document. "Thomas had been working on something before his death that Victoria's interference prevented from being implemented. He'd established a charitable foundation in your name, intended to provide emergency assistance to pregnant women facing homelessness or domestic violence." Sarah's breath caught. Even in death, Thomas had been thinking about helping people like the woman she'd become after losing him. It was as if he'd somehow known she'd faced desperate circumstances and had tried to create a safety net not just for her, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. The foundation has been dormant since his death, Chun explained. But with the additional settlement money, we could activate it. You'd have the resources to help dozens of women each year, providing them with housing assistance, medical care, job training, everything you needed but couldn't access during your own crisis. Jake's hand found hers, squeezing gently. What do you think? Ready to change the world one family at a time? Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become her chosen family, then down at Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. 6 months ago, she'd been walking down a Texas highway with nothing but desperation and determination. Now she held her daughter in a house full of love, surrounded by community, with the resources to ensure no other woman would face the same desperate circumstances alone. Yes, she said simply. Let's build something beautiful. As the celebration continued around them, Jake drew Sarah aside to the front porch where they'd first begun planning their future together. The October sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the ranch stretched before them like a promise kept. Any regrets? He asked, nodding toward the activity inside the house where Grace was being passed from person to person, each visitor eager to welcome the newest member of their community. Only one, Sarah said, leaning into his warmth. I wish Thomas could have met her. Could have seen what grew from the seeds he planted. Maybe he can, Jake replied thoughtfully. Maybe love doesn't end with death. Maybe it just changes form, becomes the foundation for new love to build on. Sarah considered this, thinking about the journey that had brought her from desperation to hope, from isolation to community, from survival to the kind of abundant life she'd never imagined possible. You think he'd approve of us, of the choices we've made? I think, Jake said carefully, that a man who loved you enough to try to protect you from his own vulnerabilities, who planned for your future even when he couldn't be part of it, would want nothing more than to see you happy and safe and building something meaningful with your life. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace began to fuss inside the house, her distinctive cry cutting through the adult voices. Sarah smiled and headed toward the sound, ready to feed her daughter and continue the routine that was becoming as natural as breathing. Coming, little one, she called softly. Mama's here. But as she reached for the door handle, she paused to look back at the ranch one more time. The place that had taken her in when she had nothing, that had given her work and shelter and the space to discover her own strength. The place where she'd learned that sometimes the most broken people could create the most beautiful things when they found each other. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of establishing Thomas's foundation, of creating the safety net that might prevent other women from facing the desperate journey she'd survived. She would plant new sections of the garden, expand the greenhouse, maybe even learn to help with the cattle operations that kept the ranch financially stable. But tonight, she would simply be grateful for Grace's healthy arrival, for Jake's steady love, for the community that had embraced them both, and for the long, unlikely chain of events that had led her from a highway outside Cedar Creek to a life more abundant than anything she'd dared to dream. The mockingbird in the oak tree began its evening song, weaving borrowed melodies into something entirely new and beautiful. Sarah listened for a moment, then went inside to feed her daughter and begin the next chapter of their story, not an ending, but a transformation that honored the past while embracing everything the future might hold. In the distance, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to a love that had survived loss and grown stronger, to a family created not by blood but by choice, and to the kind of grace that could turn a desperate woman with a cardboard suitcase into a mother, a partner, and a force for healing in a world that needed all the hope it could find. Grace Elizabeth Hartwell Reeves slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her very existence represented victory over violence, triumph over deception, and proof that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the spaces between what was lost and what was found. She was home, finally and forever, in a place where love had learned to bloom again, 3 months later, on a crisp January morning that sparkled with frost, Sarah stood in the expanded greenhouse watching Jake teach Grace about the seedlings they'd started for spring planting. At 3 months old, Grace was alert and curious, her dark eyes following the movement of his hands as he explained which plants would grow into tomatoes and which would become peppers. "See this one, little sprout?" Jake's voice carried the gentle authority he used with both babies and nervous cattle. "This is going to be a sunflower taller than your mama by summer. We'll plant it right by the front gate so everyone who visits will know this is a place where beautiful things grow." Sarah marveled at how naturally fatherhood had come to him. He'd approached caring for Grace with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to ranch management, reading every parenting book he could find and consulting with Dr. Martinez about everything from feeding schedules to developmental milestones. But beyond the research was an intuitive tenderness that made Grace light up whenever she heard his voice. The Thomas Hartwell Foundation had officially launched the week before, with Sarah serving as director and Jake as operational coordinator. Their first recipient was a young woman named Elena Rodriguez, who'd arrived at their door just before Christmas with a black eye, a 2-year-old daughter, and a story that echoed Sarah's own desperate journey. Elena was now living in the renovated bunkhouse, working part-time in the greenhouse while attending online classes to complete her nursing degree. The foundation's model was simple but comprehensive: provide safe housing, job training, childcare, and emotional support to pregnant women mothers escaping domestic violence or extreme poverty. The ranch's agricultural operations provided both employment opportunities and therapeutic activities, while the nearby community college offered educational partnerships. Most importantly, each woman was treated as a partner in her own recovery rather than a charity case requiring rescue. "Mrs. Sarah?" Elena's voice called from the greenhouse entrance. "The lady from the state agency is here for the inspection." Sarah's stomach tightened slightly. Today's visit from the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services would determine whether the foundation could expand to serve more families. The inspector would evaluate everything from the quality of housing to the safety protocols they'd established for children on the ranch. "Tell her I'll be right there," Sarah replied, then turned to Jake. "Ready for this? Are we ever ready for government inspections?" Jake grinned, but his expression grew serious as he handed Grace back to her mother. "We've done everything by the book, though. The facilities are safe, the programming is solid, and we've got 3 successful graduates who can speak to the program's effectiveness." Indeed, their first 3 residents had all moved on to independent living, one to a nursing job in Austin, another to manage a small farm outside San Antonio, and the third to open a daycare center in Cedar Creek itself. Each had taken skills learned at the ranch and transformed them into sustainable careers that could support their families. The inspection went better than Sarah had dared hope. Dr. Rebecca Winters from DFPS was thorough but impressed by the foundation's comprehensive approach and the obvious care that had gone into every detail of the operation. She spent particular time interviewing Elena and the 2 other current residents, both of whom spoke eloquently about how the program had given them not just shelter, but genuine hope for their futures. "I've seen a lot of programs," Dr. Winters told Sarah as they concluded the tour in the main house kitchen. "Most focus on either housing or job training or emotional support, but they don't integrate all 3. What you've created here is truly holistic." "We learn from experience," Sarah replied, bouncing Grace gently as the baby began to fuss. "I know what it feels like to need all those things at once, to have people want to help but not understand that survival requires more than just a roof over your head." Dr. Winters made notes on her tablet. "The state is considering a pilot program to replicate successful models like yours in other rural areas. Would you be interested in serving as a consultant to help other communities develop similar initiatives?" The possibility was both exciting and overwhelming. Sarah had never imagined her personal tragedy becoming the foundation for systemic change. But the idea of preventing other women from facing the desperate circumstances she'd survived held powerful appeal. "I'd want to discuss it with my team," she said, glancing toward Jake, who was visible through the window, working with Elena to repair a section of fence. "But yes, I think we'd be very interested." After Dr. Winters left with promises to submit a glowing report, Sarah found herself alone with Grace in the kitchen where she'd eaten her first meal as Jake's guest nearly 8 months earlier. The room looked different now, warmer, more lived in, with family photographs on the windowsill and Grace's high chair positioned where she could see the garden during feeding times. A photo collage near the stove chronicled their unconventional family's growth, Sarah's first days at the ranch, Jake teaching her to use the greenhouse equipment, their engagement on the front porch, Grace's birth, and most recently, their small wedding ceremony in the garden last month. Justice of the Peace Harold Whitman, the same man who'd married Sarah and Thomas 5 years earlier, had officiated while Martha Pemberton and Charlie Morrison served as witnesses. It had been a simple ceremony, focused more on commitment than spectacle. Sarah had worn a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric found in Mary's sewing room, while Jake had honored both his past and present by wearing his grandfather's watch and carrying Mary's wedding ring alongside the new one they'd chosen together. The vows they'd written emphasized partnership, healing, and the courage to build new love on the foundation of old wisdom. Grace stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that preceded either contentment or complaint. Sarah settled into the rocking chair they'd moved to the kitchen for convenience, beginning the familiar rhythm that soothed them both. Through the window, she could see Jake and Elena working companionably on the fence repair, their conversation punctuated by Elena's daughter, Maria, playing with the barn cats. The scene embodied everything the foundation represented: practical work that built both skills and confidence, intergenerational support that benefited everyone involved, and the kind of community that formed naturally when people felt safe and valued. Elena had arrived broken and afraid. Now she was teaching Jake Spanish while he taught her ranch management, creating the kind of mutual exchange that strengthened everyone involved. "Your daddy's a good man," Sarah whispered to Grace, who had settled into the drowsy contentment that followed nursing. "He sees potential in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." The afternoon brought its usual rhythm of small tasks and quiet conversations. Elena left for her evening classes while Jake watched Maria, who had developed a fascination with the chickens and could be trusted to collect eggs with only minimal supervision. Sarah spent the time updating foundation records and planning next month's programming, which would include a workshop on financial literacy and a visit from a representative of the local community college. By evening, the house had settled into the peaceful routine that marked their days. Maria was tucked into bed in the bunkhouse with a story and a promise that tomorrow she could help plant seeds in the greenhouse. Elena returned from class with homework that she spread across the kitchen table, occasionally asking Jake for help with math problems while Sarah prepared bottles for Grace's nighttime feedings. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't found this place," Sarah told Jake as they settled into bed, with Grace sleeping peacefully in her bassinet nearby. "If Martha hadn't told me about the ranch, if Charlie hadn't given me a ride, if you decided I was too much trouble to help." Jake pulled her closer, his voice soft in the darkness. "You would have found another way. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Sarah. You would have survived and thrived because that's who you are. Maybe, but I wouldn't have become who I am now. I wouldn't have learned that healing isn't just about recovering from trauma. It's about transforming that experience into something that can help others. And I wouldn't have learned that loving someone new doesn't diminish what you felt for someone you lost." Jake replied, "Mary will always be part of my story, but you and Grace are my present and future." As Grace made the small sleeping sounds that had become the soundtrack to their nights, Sarah reflected on the unexpected shape her life had taken a year ago. She'd been Sarah Hartwell, widow and victim, walking down a highway with nothing but desperation and determination. Now she was Sarah Reeves, mother and foundation director, partner in a thriving ranch and a marriage, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The transformation hadn't been magic. It had required hard work, difficult conversations, and the courage to trust in possibilities that seemed impossibly remote when viewed from the depths of crisis. But it had also required the kind of community support that Jake's ranch had provided, the safety net of people who were willing to invest in potential rather than judge based on current circumstances. "Jake," she said quietly, "when we expand the foundation, when we start helping other communities build similar programs, I want to make sure we never lose sight of what makes this work." Which is what? The willingness to see people as they could become rather than as they are when they arrive. You did that for me when I was exhausted and pregnant and desperate. Elena's doing it for her daughter, teaching her that circumstances don't define possibilities. Even Grace is doing it. She's proof that new life can grow from the ashes of old trauma. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of what she was saying. "You're talking about hope." "I'm talking about active hope. Not just believing things could get better, but being willing to work toward that improvement even when the outcome isn't guaranteed." Outside their bedroom window, the January wind moved through the bare branches of the oak trees, carrying the promise of spring and the renewal that would come with warmer weather. In a few months, they would plant the garden again, expand the greenhouse operations, welcome new residents to the foundation, and continue building something meaningful from the intersection of their individual stories. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their shared bedroom, with their daughter sleeping peacefully nearby and the ranch settling into winter rest around them, Sarah allowed herself to simply be grateful. Grateful for the journey that had brought her here, for the man who'd seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself, for the community that had embraced their unconventional family, and for the opportunity to transform personal pain into purposeful service. Grace sighed in her sleep, a sound of complete contentment that seemed to bless everything they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and serve and heal. But tonight, they were exactly where they belonged, home in every sense of the word, surrounded by love that had been tested by loss and proven strong enough to support whatever the future might hold. The mockingbird's evening song drifted through the window, as it had on that first night when Sarah had discovered Mary's journal and begun to understand the complexity of love and grief that could coexist in the same heart. But now the bird's borrowed melodies sounded like celebration rather than mourning, a symphony of second chances and new beginnings that would continue long after the current singers had been replaced by new voices, new stories, new examples of how broken things could be made beautiful again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.